Yesterday, something happened no one saw coming. A city glittered under neon lights, laughter bouncing off glass towers. Taxi horns screamed, tires hissed on wet asphalt. The sidewalks glimmered, reflecting 1,000 lives moving, colliding, hoping. But beneath the hum, a quiet tremor ran through its streets. A whisper of something breaking, not glass, not steel, but trust itself. He stepped onto the balcony, shoulders tense, hands gripping the railing. Not for the view, he had seen it 1,000 times. It was the silence between the waves that spoke to him. A pause in the chaos. A moment no one else noticed. Hit subscribe and tell me, what would you do if your world changed overnight? He wasn't born powerful. He wasn't born untouchable. He was shaped by whispers, by deals that smelled like money and fear. By long nights in rooms thick with smoke and ambition. By lessons no one taught out loud. By the kind of choices that leave scars invisible to everyone but yourself. The first headlines came like sparks in a dry forest. They were meant to burn. A revelation that should have shaken the foundations of power. Instead, it lit a firestorm in living rooms, diners, and online threads. People argued without seeing each other. They shouted without understanding. And in the middle of it, he sat alone, thinking about choices. The world had changed, quietly, invisibly, like water eroding stone. It wasn't just politics. It wasn't just scandal. It was the architecture of trust, built, broken, and rebuilt in secret. Phones buzzed. Messages stacked like bricks. Everyone carrying a weight. Everyone asking a question no one could answer. And then came the first glimpse of truth. What looked like a scandal was something deeper. A system bending, not breaking, but quietly shifting. A machine no one owned entirely, yet everyone depended on. And in that moment, he realized something simple. People don't fear the system itself. They fear that they might be next. The nights grew longer, colder. Neon reflections in puddles became portals into memory. A memory of ambition, of dreams deferred, of mistakes too easily forgotten. Every step he took carried the echo of choices past. And choices yet to come. He lit a cigarette, inhaled slowly, and let the smoke curl into the city sky. It wasn't just smoke. It was questions. It was doubt. It was the quiet knowledge that every action has a cost. And sometimes, that cost isn't money. It's the story you tell yourself, about fairness, about justice, about who you are. In the streets below, the city slept, or pretended to. The tremor didn't stop. It grew louder in quiet rooms, unseen corners, and minds unwilling to rest. A tension, low and constant, that hummed beneath the surface of normal life. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world tilted. It wasn't sudden. It was a shift of air, a pause in conversation, a look exchanged too long at the wrong time. And that's when everything changed. He wasn't born into power. Not even close. The world he entered as a child was small, loud, unforgiving. A house that smelled of old leather and coffee. A father who measured love in ledger books. And a mother whose silence could fill a room. He learned early that rules were made for someone else. That the game didn't care about fairness. It cared about survival. And he decided, before he could even name it, that he would survive. But not quietly. Not humbly. In the summer heat, the streets offered lessons too. Sirens, shouting, broken glass. All stitched together like a harsh symphony of reality. He watched men and women climb, stumble, and fall. And he saw the invisible line that separated them. Fear, and the courage to confront it. He wasn't a hero. Not yet. He was a witness. To ambition, to deceit, to the hunger that makes people do things they will regret, or forget, or pretend never happened. The first lesson came on a Tuesday. A handshake in a smoky office. The deal was simple, in words. Complicated in meaning. A favor exchanged, a secret kept, a door opened. He felt it then, the pulse of power. Not in the money, not in the applause. But in the ability to decide, who gets in, who stays out, who lives and who waits. It was intoxicating. It was terrifying. He walked the city streets at night, neon humming against wet asphalt. Every billboard, every honking horn, every fleeting glance told the same story. Control is the illusion everyone craves. Freedom is the lie everyone tells themselves. And yet, he dreamed. Not of wealth. Not of fame. But of a world where he could shape his own rules. Where he could fight a system that had already decided his place. Where, somehow, he could bend reality without breaking it. The people around him called him reckless. They called him ambitious. They whispered, dangerous, behind closed doors. And maybe they were right. Maybe danger was the only way to stay alive. The first time he tasted real influence, it wasn't loud. It wasn't celebrated. It was a subtle shift in conversation, a pause in the room. A smile that said, you have a choice. Use it wisely. And in that pause, he understood something crucial. Power isn't given. Power is noticed. And then it's demanded. He wasn't alone in learning these lessons. A system had taught him, quietly, invisibly. Every rule, every loophole, every soft spot in the armor of the world. And he realized, to fight it, he would first need to understand it. It wasn't just ambition. It was survival. It was curiosity. It was the quiet, burning desire to see the machine for what it was. And then decide whether to operate it, or dismantle it. Sometimes he wondered, in those rare, still moments. Did he chase power, or did power chase him? And that question haunted him, even in the brightest rooms. He lit a cigarette and watched the smoke rise. It curled and twisted. As if it knew the truth. Everything comes with a cost. Everything demands a choice. And that's when he decided. He would not just play the game. He would rewrite it. And the city, the world, would never be the same. At first, it looked like progress. A few headlines, a few gestures, a few smiles in the right rooms. The city celebrated quietly, thinking the world had changed overnight. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. Slowly. Almost imperceptibly. Rules that once seemed solid began to bend. Appointments came and went without explanation. Promises echoed in empty halls. People nodded politely, but their eyes told a different story. Trust, it seemed, was a currency no one could hold on to. He watched it unfold from his high-rise office. Lights of the city sprawled below. Cars glinting like liquid gold on wet streets. And he realized, the game was never fair. It had never been fair. It only pretended to be. The first cracks appeared in whispers. A deal delayed. A name that disappeared from the record. An argument that never reached a conclusion. Every small omission, every hesitation. A sign the machine was quietly recalibrating itself. People began to panic, not openly. Quiet panic, behind closed doors. In kitchens, in boardrooms, in online feeds. An invisible pressure pressing on everyone's chest. Affordability, opportunity, security, all suddenly felt fragile. Like ice over a deep river, ready to crack. He saw it in the eyes of the voters. Confusion. Fear. A hunger for someone to tell them what was true. And no one did. Because no one knew. Or maybe, everyone knew, but no one wanted to admit it. The system, he realized, wasn't failing. It was working exactly as it was designed. A network of influence, secrecy, and unspoken rules. A delicate balance of fear and greed. And the public, oblivious, thought it was chaos. But it was only the quiet hum of control. He called a meeting. A room full of advisors, lawyers, and those who thought they understood power. Everyone spoke in measured tones. And yet, the tension was palpable. No one could ignore it. No one could fix it. Outside, the city's lights flickered. Neon reflections danced on rain-soaked streets. Somewhere, a siren wailed, not an emergency, just a reminder. The world was moving. But not in the direction anyone expected. He thought about the headlines that would come tomorrow. The stories already shaping minds. And the truth, dangerous, untouchable, hidden, was that the system didn't bend for the people. It bent for those who knew how to wield it. And then came the moment of clarity. A phone call in the dead of night. A whisper of information that would change everything. Not public yet. Not widely known. But undeniable. And in that whisper, the city held its breath. Because the question was never who won. It was who decided what winning means. The tremor under the surface grew stronger. People could feel it, even if they couldn't name it. The tension wasn't just political. It was personal. It was societal. It was moral. And he understood, there was no going back. The cracks were too wide. The stakes too high. And the game he had chosen to play was about to change the rules forever. What looked like freedom was dependency. A city buzzing with lights, promises, and ambition. But underneath, it was held together by strings few could see. Contracts, favors, debts, some written, some whispered, some never spoken at all. He saw it in the corridors of power. A handshake meant more than a law. A nod carried more weight than a headline. And suddenly, the world felt smaller. More fragile. And yet, more predictable than anyone realized. The information came in pieces. Documents, recordings, notes jotted in the margins. Each fragment a window into a system most assumed was invisible. But it wasn't invisible. It was intentionally opaque. The revelation wasn't dramatic. No explosions, no fanfare, no sudden collapse. It was quiet. Subtle. Like watching a clock slowly unwind from the inside. The rules everyone had trusted for generations were never fair. They weren't broken. They were never meant to be fair. The system didn't fail, it functioned exactly as it was designed. For power. For control. For those who knew how to navigate the shadows. He thought about the people on the streets. The families struggling with bills, rent, groceries. The ones working harder and harder while the cost of living rose faster than wages. And he realized something the world refuses to admit. The problem isn't greed. The problem is structure. A system built to survive itself. Not the people within it. He traced it through boardrooms and courtrooms, through legislation and lobbying, through media narratives crafted with surgical precision. It was a machine, intricate and unyielding. And the public, the masses, were only spectators, watching the pieces move and hoping they didn't get caught in the gears. A name appeared on a report. An old associate, once trusted, now quietly informing the puzzle. What he revealed changed the narrative entirely. The whispers were true. The deals were bigger than anyone imagined. And the story, the one printed in morning papers, was only a shadow of reality. The people thought they saw a scandal. They didn't see the architecture behind it. The scaffolding of influence. The invisible hands shaping outcomes before anyone could react. It was a revelation, not in shock, but in clarity. A moment when the illusion fell away. And for the first time, he could see the full map. Every corner, every loophole, every player. And he understood, the fight wasn't just about headlines. It wasn't about reputation or votes. It was about the very mechanism that defined who could rise and who would fall. And the system? It didn't bend for outrage. It bent for understanding. For calculation. For those who had learned the rhythm of its pulse. He stepped back from the papers, letting the weight settle. It was heavy. Not in the physical sense. But in the knowledge of what humans do when survival, ambition, and secrecy collide. And then, almost imperceptibly, the pieces began to shift again. The revelation wasn't static. It was a spark. A motion. A tremor through the carefully balanced machine. And in that movement, he saw it clearly. The game was never about right or wrong. It was about who could see the rules. And who could rewrite them. What looked like chaos was always intentional. The city was alive, but it didn't feel alive. Sirens screamed in the distance. Neon lights flickered on puddles like broken promises. And somewhere, a child cried, unseen, unheard. He couldn't escape it. The truth pressed against his chest. Not a physical weight. But a moral one. Everything he had learned, everything he had seen. It all converged in a single, unbearable clarity. You can't buy freedom. You can't legislate fairness. You can only choose who you'll be when everything falls apart. The phone rang. A name flashed. Someone he trusted, or thought he trusted. And the call didn't bring answers. It brought more questions. More evidence of the machinery moving behind closed doors. More proof that the world wasn't a place for the naive. The headlines were merciless. Social media burned like wildfire. Every post, every clip, every opinion, feeding on itself. Amplifying fear, outrage, uncertainty. And he realized, the storm wasn't outside. It was inside. Inside every mind, every conscience, every soul trying to navigate a world where nothing was guaranteed, and everything was leveraged. The streets themselves seemed to pulse with anxiety. People moving faster, shouting louder, yet accomplishing nothing. The invisible hand of the system guiding every decision. Every reaction, every hope. And then came the moment of truth. The instant when the machine's patterns became undeniable. A revelation so stark it left no room for doubt. The system wasn't broken. It wasn't failing. It was functioning perfectly. Perfectly for some. And catastrophically for the rest. He saw families balancing bills, cutting corners, sacrificing sleep. He saw dreams deferred in silence. He saw ambition suffocated by circumstance. And he saw himself, not above it, not apart from it, but in the eye of it all. Decisions needed to be made. Not calculated ones. Not political ones. Human ones. He stood on the balcony again. Watching smoke curl from chimneys below. Lights reflected in puddles like fractured mirrors. And he knew, in the quiet chaos, that choices define everything. Even when the world seems unstoppable, even when it feels inevitable. The storm wasn't the headlines. It wasn't the panic. It wasn't the machines of influence or wealth. It was the reckoning within every person who refused to look away. And in that storm, he found clarity. Not comfort. Not victory. But understanding. A realization echoed through him. You can survive chaos. But only if you know who you are when it hits. And then, silence spoke louder. The city had quieted. Not because the chaos had ended. But because people had paused. A collective breath, taken without thinking. Filling empty streets, dark alleys, and high-rise towers alike. He walked slowly, letting the weight of the storm settle. It wasn't over. It wouldn't ever be over. But for a moment, the world seemed less opaque. The gears, the whispers, the hidden hands. They were still there, but now visible. Freedom isn't guaranteed. It's passed down, one brave choice at a time. He remembered the child he had seen from the balcony. Eyes wide with wonder and fear. He thought about families struggling quietly. Neighbors helping neighbors in ways no headlines could capture. He thought about the resilience of ordinary people. How they endure, adapt, survive. And in that reflection, he found a kind of peace. The system was flawed. It was harsh. But humans, flawed as they were, could still make choices that mattered. Even small ones. Even quiet ones. Even unseen ones. He lit a cigarette, letting the smoke drift into the night. Every inhale a reminder that life moves in moments. Every exhale a release of tension, fear, and anger. And he understood, the true power wasn't in headlines or influence. It was in the courage to act, to decide, to stand. The world would continue to shift. But so long as people remembered their humanity. There was hope. Not guaranteed. Not easy. But present. He turned from the balcony. Steps echoing softly in an empty hallway. And in that quiet, he whispered to himself. And maybe, that's how it all begins again. The streets were quieter than usual, but the undercurrent hummed louder than ever. Grocery lines stretched further, rents climbed higher, and the news feeds never rested. People weren't angry yet, not fully. They were nervous, scanning prices, counting bills, calculating the impossible. He walked among them, unseen. Not to spy. But to feel it, the pulse of everyday fear. The anxiety stitched into ordinary lives. A mother argued quietly with a cashier. Her voice calm but trembling. As if the world would crack if she raised it too loud. A father tightened his coat. Hands shaking as he counted coins. Trying to stretch yesterday's paycheck into tomorrow's hope. This wasn't politics anymore. It was survival. And the gap between what people thought they could manage. And what the system demanded. Was growing, silently, like a crack widening in concrete. He remembered the whispers from earlier. Deals made in private, promises broken, advantages leveraged. The same system that shaped headlines, shaped wealth, shaped influence. Now pressed against ordinary lives with quiet inevitability. Every announcement from above felt like a distant echo. Words without meaning, policies without impact. People adapted, adjusted, but slowly, inevitably. The weight pressed harder. And yet, there was something else. Something humans always carry when the world tilts too far. Resilience. Ingenuity. A stubborn refusal to surrender completely. He saw it in the teenager fixing a neighbor's broken fence. In the barista giving free coffee to the worried customer. In the old man who left extra bread on the table for anyone who came by. Small acts, but monumental in their quiet insistence. That humanity persists even when the world seems against it. Meanwhile, headlines shouted of scandal, whispers of power, debates that never reached answers. People clicked, shared, argued, a storm in their hands. But the real storm was invisible. Rising costs. Vanishing opportunities. The silent terror of affordability outpacing wages. Of dreams deferred not by choice, but by circumstance. He realized something. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as intended. It rewarded foresight, privilege, influence. And punished the rest. Slowly. Relentlessly. He lit a cigarette and watched the smoke drift across neon reflections. And he understood, people weren't just worried about money. They were worried about their place, their dignity, their ability to live the life they imagined. And no amount of headlines could explain that fear. In the quiet of a late-night diner, he watched people sip coffee and scroll phones. Every face told a story. Every gesture hinted at anxiety buried beneath routine. The cracks were everywhere. And the city didn't notice. And yet, even in fear, there was defiance. Even in struggle, there was choice. And that choice, small, unseen, persistent, was the only light in the storm. The question lingered, heavier than any headline. When the system works against you. When chaos feels inevitable. Who will you be when everything falls apart? And that tension. It wasn't going anywhere. The city never slept, but the people began to tire. The hum of neon, the roar of traffic, the ceaseless chatter of media. It all pressed against them like weight they couldn't set down. Every day brought new numbers, new warnings, new headlines. Affordability wasn't just a word anymore. It was a shadow over every kitchen table, every apartment door, every paycheck counted twice. He walked among them in disguise, a hoodie pulled low, hands in pockets. No one noticed. No one cared to notice. And maybe that was the point. When the system bends against you, anonymity becomes your only shield. In the grocery store, a young mother clutched her cart as if it were a lifeboat. She whispered numbers under her breath. Adding items, removing items, adjusting the invisible ledger of survival. Her child tugged at her sleeve, asking questions she didn't have the answers for. Questions about dinner, about school, about tomorrow. And she smiled anyway. Because smiling was a kind of defiance. Outside, the city's skyline glittered like a promise it couldn't keep. Billboards flashed advertisements for luxury condos, for vacations, for gadgets that seemed essential until you counted your bills. People passed without looking. Or if they did, it was a glance filled with longing and resignation. The disparity was glaring, cruel, and unavoidable. Meanwhile, in quiet offices, whispers moved faster than light. Deals made on the sly, favors exchanged, influence leveraged. Nothing illegal, at least not on paper. Everything legal. And the system bent exactly as it was engineered to. For some, a ladder to climb. For others, a wall they couldn't scale. He watched it all and felt a familiar pulse of anger, not the hot, screaming kind. But the slow, cold anger of realization. People weren't failing. They weren't lazy, ignorant, or undeserving. They were trapped in a design they didn't build and couldn't escape. And yet, humans persisted. In every alley, every apartment, every street corner. Small acts of courage flickered like candlelight. A neighbor lending money. A teacher staying late to tutor a struggling student. A friend covering a shift so someone could feed their family. These small sparks were fragile. But they reminded him that even in a broken system, humanity endured. He thought of the headlines he had seen earlier that morning. They screamed scandal, outrage, accusation. But the scandal was nowhere near as real as the quiet, daily struggle of millions. And for the first time, he felt the full weight of it. Power and influence were intoxicating. But empathy? Empathy was the real rarity. The rarest commodity in a world obsessed with winning. In his solitude, he lit a cigarette, the smoke curling like questions he couldn't answer. He wondered how much time passed before people understood the truth. The system doesn't bend for outrage. It doesn't bend for panic. It bends for knowledge, strategy, and persistence. And those who lacked it. The most vulnerable, the struggling, the ordinary. They paid the cost. Every single day. The streets below echoed with laughter and argument. A symphony of survival playing against a neon backdrop. And he felt it in his chest. The tension, the anxiety, the fear. It wasn't just economic. It was moral. It was human. And it demanded something more than headlines. It demanded action. The city would continue its rhythm. The system would continue its work. But in the shadows, in quiet corners, in people who refused to give up. The possibility of change flickered. And that flicker, small, fragile, fleeting, was enough to keep hope alive. Because even when the odds are stacked against you, even when the machinery of power moves silently, relentlessly, there's always a choice. And humanity, stubborn as it is, never forgets to make it. And that realization, sharp and undeniable, was heavier than any headline, louder than any scandal, and more powerful than anything the city's lights could ever reflect. And in that wait, he found purpose. The city was restless. Not loud, not violent, yet it hummed with unease. Every step on wet asphalt carried a weight. Every glance from a neighbor a question unanswered. And everyone, it seemed, was waiting for something to break. The news cycles churned, repeating the same words. Scandal. Outrage. Shock. But people were beginning to notice the gaps between stories and reality. The headlines didn't show the bills stacked on kitchen counters, or the families skipping meals to pay rent, or the workers whose wages barely kept pace with the rising cost of life. He moved through the city in quiet observation, a witness to lives pressed under invisible hands. He passed a bakery where a man counted change 3 times before buying bread. He saw an elderly woman clutch her medications, calculating which dose she could skip. And in those fleeting moments, he understood something terrifying. The system wasn't failing these people. It was functioning exactly as intended. Behind closed doors, deals were happening at a different rhythm. Names whispered, contracts signed, influence leveraged. Nothing illegal, nothing visible, yet everything consequential. The gap between the system and the people widened. It wasn't a chasm of law. It was a chasm of understanding, of empathy, of humanity. In cafes and diners, conversations ran low and tense. Have you seen the rent? They're raising prices again. Don't know how we'll make it this month. Each sentence carried quiet panic, subtle fury, and resignation all at once. It wasn't loud, but it was relentless. The storm was building. He stopped by a subway station, watching commuters shuffle past. Everyone carried invisible burdens. Bills, expectations, dreams deferred, hopes dimmed. No one looked at each other. No one could afford the luxury of connection. And yet, he noticed small rebellions. A shared umbrella in the rain. A smile offered without expectation. A stranger holding a door for another. Humanity persisted, fragile and defiant. The political elite debated endlessly, oblivious to the real stakes below. Their arguments were abstract, removed, rehearsed. They spoke of balance sheets, of policy, of strategy. They did not speak of fear in the living rooms of ordinary people, or of children growing up thinking opportunity was a rumor. And that, he realized, was the ultimate revelation. Power was measured not by headlines, but by who could influence the invisible forces that shaped daily life. And the people, unknowingly, were powerless. Not because they were weak, but because the system was invisible to them. He lit a cigarette, smoke curling against the night. And he thought. This is the storm before change. Not chaos, not spectacle, not outrage. But a slow, relentless pressure on the human spirit. The city lights flickered, mirroring uncertainty. Sirens wailed somewhere in the distance. Every hum of machinery, every passing car, every hurried footstep was a reminder, the world keeps moving. Even when the people feel they cannot. And then it hit him, sharply, like a crack in glass. Change would not come from anger alone. It would not come from headlines. It would not come from outrage, nor from silence. It would come from clarity. From courage. From choosing, even when the odds were stacked impossibly high. And as he exhaled the cigarette smoke, the city breathed with him. Every struggle, every quiet defiance, every unacknowledged act of resilience was a reminder. Even in the storm, humanity is never fully extinguished. And that truth, quiet and persistent, was heavier than fear, louder than despair, and more enduring than any system built to contain it. The documents arrived quietly. No headlines, no cameras, no fanfare. Just a folder on his desk, heavy with paper, heavy with implication. He opened it slowly, leafing through pages filled with numbers, names, and dates. Every line told a story of influence, of privilege, of silent control. Every omission shouted louder than any declaration. The patterns were clear. Connections invisible to the public eye. Power exerted through subtle nudges, small favors, strategic silences. It wasn't criminal, at least not in the legal sense. It was systemic. Endemic. And brutally effective. He leaned back in his chair, cigarette still burning in the ashtray. The smoke curled like questions he couldn't yet answer. How could so many lives hinge on decisions made in rooms no one knew existed? How could opportunity be distributed with such precision to some, and withheld from the rest? Outside, the city hummed with oblivion. People went about their routines, unaware of the invisible machinery shaping their day. Their bills, their jobs, their very futures. The system moved seamlessly, silently. And the public marveled at the headlines, not realizing they were only a shadow of reality. He thought of families counting pennies, of workers skipping meals. Of students postponing dreams, of neighbors quietly helping neighbors. The human cost wasn't abstract. It was tangible, visceral, unavoidable. The documents weren't just information. They were evidence of human consequence. Of lives shaped by design. Of dreams constrained by invisible forces. He called a meeting. Not with lawyers, not with advisors. With people who could understand the stakes. People who could act with both calculation and conscience. The room was silent as he laid the papers on the table. The weight of them filled the space. No one spoke at first. And then, slowly, questions began to surface. Questions about responsibility. Questions about morality. Questions about the courage it would take to confront a system built to resist confrontation. And he realized, the story wasn't just about power. It wasn't about privilege or scandal. It was about understanding. About seeing the machine in motion. And about choosing whether to step inside, or stand apart. The revelation was profound because it was simple. The system didn't bend for outrage. It didn't bend for noise. It bent for knowledge. For persistence. For those who understood it. And the most vulnerable, the ordinary people. They moved like pawns in a game they didn't even know existed. He lit another cigarette and watched the smoke curl against the neon glow outside. And for the first time, he understood the responsibility that came with knowledge. Not fame, not fortune, not influence. Responsibility. To act. To choose. To bear the weight of understanding. Outside, the city slept, unaware of the machinery at work. But inside him, a storm raged. Not of panic. But of clarity. Not of anger. But of purpose. The revelation wasn't just about the system. It was about what humans do when confronted with the truth. And when he looked around the room, he knew. The choices ahead would define everything. Because understanding without action is complicity. And complicity has consequences. The city shivered as if sensing the pressure. Sirens split the night. Traffic lights blinked uncertainly. A distant explosion of sound, somewhere far enough to be ignored, but close enough to be felt. The storm wasn't external anymore. It was inside everyone, building, pressing, gnawing at patience, at hope, at ordinary courage. People whispered in kitchens. They argued quietly in cafes. They calculated every dollar, every choice, every risk. Because life had begun to feel like walking a tightrope over an abyss. He watched it all unfold, moving through alleys, past subway stations, across plazas. The air smelled of rain, asphalt, and fear. Not fear of headlines. Not fear of scandal. Fear of living in a world where the rules were invisible. Where every decision could tip the balance between survival and despair. The headlines screamed another name, another revelation. Another layer of secrecy peeled back like a wound. And yet, the public barely connected it to their lives. To their rising rents. To their dwindling savings. To the growing unease that pressed into their bones. Meanwhile, deals were struck in silence. Rooms closed to cameras and microphones. Favors exchanged. Promises made. And the system hummed quietly, efficiently. Like a clock ticking for those who knew how to read its hands. People's resilience began to fray. Arguments over bills became fights at home. Patience snapped in lines at grocery stores. Frustration licked at the edges of every conversation. And yet, even in chaos, glimmers of humanity persisted. Neighbors sharing meals, commuters holding umbrellas for strangers. Teachers staying late for students no one else noticed. He stopped to watch a mother argue with a cashier over a handful of groceries. Her voice was calm, but her hands shook. The cashier apologized, hands trembling. Neither could fix the underlying problem. The system was indifferent to their struggle. It didn't care. It only existed. And then came the message. A single text, brief, urgent, almost too small to matter. It contained information, previously hidden, about the invisible mechanics of power. A hint of what was really happening behind the headlines. And it hit him, sharply, like a knife. The storm wasn't just external. It was systemic. It was human. And it demanded confrontation. He felt the familiar pulse of anger. Cold and precise, rising from deep within. Not a hot, reckless anger. But the slow, relentless pressure of understanding. The kind that demands action. The kind that forces choices. And the people. They were moving like shadows. Shuffling through streets unaware of the machinery guiding their lives. The invisible gears turning above their heads. But he saw it all. And seeing is responsibility. He lit a cigarette and inhaled deeply. Smoke curled, twisting like the consequences waiting to be faced. And he realized. This storm wouldn't end until someone acted. Until someone chose to stand. To decide who they would be, even when everything fell apart. And the storm roared louder. Not outside. Not visibly. But inside. Inside every heart, every mind, every conscience that could not ignore the truth. And in that roar, he understood. The moment for choice had arrived. And history would remember those who acted. And those who merely waited. The night had thickened, pressing against the city like a living thing. Neon signs flickered uncertainly, reflecting off slick asphalt and puddles. While the distant hum of traffic and sirens became a low, constant vibration. People moved through it, oblivious to the storm beneath their feet. But he could feel it, every heartbeat, every breath, every tremor of unease. The turning point wasn't dramatic. There were no explosions, no declarations, no sudden collapses. It came quietly, like a shift in the wind. A moment when clarity cuts sharper than chaos ever could. He remembered the mother counting pennies at the grocery store. The teenager working 2 jobs to pay for school. The elderly man clutching his medications. Every one of them weighed down by a system that promised fairness but delivered indifference. And he realized, the system wouldn't change itself. No headline would fix it. No outrage could bend the invisible gears. The power to alter reality rested somewhere else. Not in wealth. Not in position. But in action. In choice. In the courage to step forward when everything screamed to stay silent. He walked along the riverbank, lights from the city shimmering across the water. The reflections twisted and fractured like the lives being bent by unseen forces. He lit a cigarette, smoke curling and dissolving into the night air. And in that quiet moment, he understood the truth. Change isn't given. It isn't polite. It isn't televised. It is taken. Decisions had to be made. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Now. A message arrived, subtle, almost understated, a tip, a leak, a fragment of information that could shift everything. It revealed not just a scandal, not just influence, not just secrecy. But the very architecture of control. And with that knowledge came a responsibility so heavy it felt like gravity itself. He remembered the headlines, the debates, the arguments swirling online. None of it mattered. What mattered was human consequence. Lives pressed under invisible weight, struggling quietly, fighting battles no one could see. And in that fight, he realized, he could no longer stand aside. The storm outside mirrored the storm inside him. A storm of ethics, of fear, of determination. Every choice, every step, every whispered decision could tip the balance. And he chose to act. He didn't know how. He didn't know if it would succeed. But he knew one thing. Inaction would guarantee failure. The city pulsed around him, indifferent, unaware. Taxi horns, train rumbles, footsteps on wet concrete. A rhythm that had always felt ordinary. But now sounded urgent. Every sound a reminder that life continues. Even when the people living it feel powerless. He made calls. Whispers turned to coordination. Fragmented knowledge became strategy. And as he moved through the network of influence, secrecy, and opportunity, he began to see the shape of possibility. The turning point wasn't a single act. It was a series of choices, layered and precise. Each one building towards something larger. Something that could disrupt the machinery without destroying it. Something that could bend power toward humanity. And in the quiet moments between decisions, he reflected. Power isn't in headlines. It's not in scandal. It's in understanding. In patience. In knowing when to move, and when to wait. He stepped onto a balcony as dawn broke. The first light cut through the haze of the city. Casting long shadows across the buildings. Reflecting in puddles like fractured mirrors of reality. And for a moment, the world seemed balanced. Poised. Waiting for what would come next. He exhaled smoke, letting it drift toward the rising sun. The storm hadn't ended. The struggle hadn't ceased. But he had chosen. And choosing, in a world designed to discourage it, was the first victory. Because in that choice, he understood. The turning point is never a moment. It's a decision. A series of decisions. And history bends toward those who dare to make them. And in the stillness of that morning, he whispered to himself. This is the moment everything changes. The city stirred awake, unaware that decisions had been made in the shadows. Neon lights dimmed with the dawn. And the streets seemed ordinary, but ordinary had changed. The tension that had hummed beneath the surface yesterday now thrummed visibly, like a heartbeat you could almost touch. He moved through the city quietly, observing. Storefronts opening, workers rushing, children laughing on stoops. Yet beneath every smile, every nod, there was a pulse of uncertainty. The storm he had felt inside was now manifesting in subtle ways. Lines growing at ATMs, food prices ticking upward, the ever-present buzz of anxiety in every conversation. A small diner smelled of coffee and frying bacon. The waitress moved quickly, trying to keep up with orders. But behind her eyes was exhaustion, the invisible weight of struggle. A man counted coins for breakfast, small amounts, measured, calculated. Each penny felt like a life raft, keeping him afloat in a sea of unpredictability. And outside, the wheels of power turned, quietly, efficiently. The leaks he had acted on began to ripple. Some names whispered in secret meetings were now under scrutiny. Documents crossed desks, emails were read, phone calls made in hushed tones. Every choice he had set in motion was now cascading. Not violently, not openly, but inexorably, like water eroding stone. People began to notice small shifts. A headline buried in the corner of a newspaper. A mention on a local radio station. An inexplicable policy adjustment. Nothing dramatic. Nothing cinematic. But enough for those who paid attention to understand. Change, subtle and invisible, was beginning to move through the system. And yet, the cost was immediate. Ordinary people bore the weight first. A landlord raising rent before understanding the implications. A local store increasing prices due to supplier panic. Families adjusting, rearranging, sacrificing once more. The ripple of decisions didn't arrive gently. It landed hard, like a stone dropped into the calm waters of everyday life. He paused on a bridge overlooking the river. The water reflected the city's lights in fractured, restless patterns. It reminded him of human lives, mirrored and fractured. Twisting under pressure yet still moving forward. And in that reflection, he understood something essential. Action always has consequences. Even righteous action. Even necessary action. A young couple argued quietly on the sidewalk. The husband's voice low, tense. The wife's hand clutching a child's coat. They weren't angry at each other. They were angry at circumstance. At the cost of decisions they had no control over. And he realized, this was the human face of change. The sacrifice inherent in every turning point. Meanwhile, in offices, boardrooms, and political backrooms, the storm intensified invisibly. Power brokers recalculated. Advisors whispered. Strategies adjusted. The machinery of influence shifted, imperceptibly. Reacting to the choices that had been set into motion. The invisible threads of control pulled taut. And the people below felt every tremor. He walked through a park where children played under early sunlight. Even here, life seemed fragile. Even here, hope felt temporary. And yet, he also saw resilience. Neighbors helping neighbors, strangers sharing umbrellas, small acts of kindness that refused to be crushed by circumstance. It was a paradox he couldn't ignore. The system was merciless. The cost of movement fell disproportionately on the vulnerable. Yet humanity endured. And that endurance, quiet as it was more powerful than any headline, any policy, any leak. He lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly, watching the smoke dissolve into the rising sun. The choices he had made, the actions he had set into motion, would ripple for months, maybe years. Some would succeed. Some would fail. Some would cost lives in ways no one could predict. But the point wasn't control. It was impact. It was courage. It was understanding that standing still in a broken system is itself a choice. And often the most dangerous one. The city pulsed beneath him, unaware, moving forward. And he felt the weight of consequence in every corner, every street, every life touched. This was the turning point realized. Not through spectacle. Not through triumph. But through human cost, human endurance, and human choice. And in that weight, he whispered to himself. The storm isn't over. It's only beginning. The city was no longer quiet. The hum of daily life had been replaced by a rhythm of tension. Sirens echoed endlessly, slicing through alleys and streets. People whispered in groups, glancing over shoulders, scanning the sky for signs of something they couldn't name. The storm had arrived. It started small. A protest in a plaza. A line of voices chanting quietly, steadily, their words carrying like ripples on water. Signs handmade, slogans improvised. Faces determined, weary, resolute. The media covered it unevenly, some highlighting anger, some ignoring entirely. But the people didn't need attention. They needed to be heard. He walked among them, observing without being observed. The system he had studied, the mechanisms he had understood, now collided with its most unpredictable element, human will. And the collision was beautiful, terrifying, necessary. An elderly man raised his voice, trembling, yet undeniably strong. Enough. We've paid our dues. We've stayed quiet long enough. The crowd murmured agreement. A young woman stepped forward, holding her child. We can't wait for change to reach us. We have to make it happen ourselves. And suddenly, the energy shifted. The storm was no longer abstract. It had faces, names, reasons, and outrage. Meanwhile, in the offices of power, the ripples became waves. Whispers became panic. Emails and memos raced across networks. People who had assumed control felt the first tremors of fear. And the truth, the one he had glimpsed, studied, and prepared for, was now undeniable. The streets surged. People shared what they knew, what they had witnessed, what they could no longer ignore. Rumors became facts. Facts became action. And the machinery of influence began to falter, creak, hesitate. He saw neighbors protecting each other. Workers refusing to leave posts until colleagues were safe. Small acts of bravery, tiny sparks that collectively became wildfire. Even the system's most rigid structures began to bend under human persistence. It was unpredictable. It was uncontrollable. And it was alive. Yet the storm carried danger. The wrong step could break fragile lives. The system, for all its cracks, had tools of retaliation. People disappeared from jobs. Voices were silenced. Favors were called back. And yet, even knowing the risk, people persisted. Because the alternative, submission, had already failed them. He lit a cigarette, smoke curling into the early morning light. The streets below reflected fractured neon, mirroring the chaos and determination above. He thought about the countless people caught in the machinery. Families balancing bills, teenagers working 2 jobs, the elderly calculating every dose of medicine. And he understood something profoundly human. Courage isn't glamorous. It's quiet. It's calculated. It's persistence in the face of invisible, relentless pressure. The city itself seemed to respond. Windows rattled with the chants. Subways clattered beneath the streets like a heartbeat. Traffic slowed, then stopped. And the human tide moved steadily, impossibly, against the currents of wealth, influence, and invisible control. He realized, finally, that the storm wasn't the people. It wasn't the headlines. It wasn't even the system itself. The storm was the intersection of them all. Human will meeting invisible machinery. Power confronting consequence. Choice challenging inevitability. And in that moment, he felt the weight of history. Every step taken, every risk accepted, every act of courage or defiance, was a ripple in the fabric of the city, of the system, of human life itself. The smoke from his cigarette drifted into the wind. And he understood, the outcome wasn't guaranteed. It never is. But the choice to act, to stand, to persist. That was everything. And as the sun broke through clouds over the city, he whispered, almost to himself. The storm isn't over. It has only found its voice. The city had reached a fever pitch. Sirens no longer startled anyone, they were part of the rhythm now. Footsteps echoed like drumbeats, a human pulse over wet asphalt. Windows rattled with collective anticipation. Streetlights flickered like hesitant witnesses. And somewhere, a child laughed, unaware of the storm brewing just beyond their small world. He moved through the streets, the weight of knowledge heavy in his chest. Every choice he had made, every decision he had nudged into motion, was colliding now with human action. The streets weren't just full of people, they were full of consequence. Voices rose. Some shouted for justice. Some whispered warnings. Some cried quietly, barely audible over the clamor of determination and fear. And in every voice, there was truth. A truth long buried beneath headlines, policies, and invisible systems. A confrontation was inevitable. The leaders in power, those who thought themselves untouchable, were beginning to notice the tremors. Their meetings became frantic. Their strategies reactive, not proactive. And the system, the machine they trusted to control everything, stuttered under the weight of human persistence. He found himself in a plaza, the epicenter of gathering. People surrounded him without realizing it. Faces illuminated by neon and early morning light. Eyes wide, filled with fear, hope, exhaustion, and determination all at once. And he realized, the storm had taken shape. Not abstract. Not distant. Alive. A young man stepped forward, voice cracking but steady. We will not be ignored. We will not wait for permission to live. Others joined in. Chants rose in waves, building like fire across stone and concrete. And in that sound, there was clarity. The power of numbers. The power of moral urgency. The power of people refusing to be invisible. But even as the crowd swelled, tension grew. The system's response was inevitable. Authority, subtle and overt, pressed down. Not with outright violence, not yet. But with surveillance, with threats, with invisible pressures designed to fracture unity. And still, people persisted. Every step a risk. Every voice a defiance. He looked at the faces around him. The mother holding a child close. The teenager clutching textbooks like armor. The elderly man gripping his coat. And he felt a rush of something that had been building inside him. A mix of fear, hope, awe, and resolve. Because human courage is rarely spectacular. It is persistent. It is deliberate. It is patient. And it is unstoppable when it finds a foothold. The first cracks in the system's armor became visible. Decisions that once seemed untouchable began to falter. Officials whispered among themselves, their certainty shaken. Policies once assumed immutable now wavered. And the crowd, sensing this shift, pressed forward with quiet precision. Every chant, every step, every glance a carefully placed force against inertia. He remembered the people he had observed over weeks. The mother counting pennies, the workers clocking overtime, the neighbors quietly helping each other. This was their moment. The culmination of endurance, struggle, and moral insistence. And it was terrifying. Because with visibility comes responsibility. With persistence comes exposure. And with courage comes risk. He lit a cigarette, letting the smoke curl lazily into the morning air. Even in that chaos, in that confrontation, there was something calm, something deliberate. This wasn't panic. It wasn't spectacle. It was human truth asserting itself. And truth, once acknowledged, cannot be fully suppressed. The authorities made their move. Not violent, but visible. Steps calculated, eyes watching, the invisible machinery attempting to regain control. And the people, the ordinary, the resilient, the courageous, didn't flinch. They didn't retreat. They held their ground. And in that stand, he understood something essential. The storm wasn't about winning. It wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about recognition. Acknowledgement of existence. Acknowledgement that ordinary people, long ignored, could shape reality when they refused to be silent. The sky above began to lighten. Sun breaking through clouds in fractured beams. And for a moment, everything felt suspended. The city, the system, the people, all in a delicate balance. And he whispered to himself, calm amidst chaos. This is the moment where everything is revealed. Because the storm is not just destruction. It is awakening. It is the collision of truth and consequence. And in that collision, the world tilts. And then, silence spoke louder. The city was quieter now. Not silent, never silent. But the cacophony of urgency, fear, and tension had softened. Sirens faded into the distance, and footsteps no longer echoed like drumbeats of rebellion. Instead, the streets carried a slower rhythm, one tempered by consequence and reflection. He walked through the plazas, the alleys, the cafes. Everything was the same, yet profoundly different. The debris of confrontation lingered, flyers caught in grates, discarded signs, cups left on sidewalks. But it was not chaos. It was proof. Proof that human persistence could leave a mark, even on the most indifferent system. People moved cautiously, cautiously aware of what had passed. The mother counting pennies at the grocery store now smiled faintly as her child tugged at her sleeve. The young man who had shouted in the plaza walked with a lighter step. And even the elderly man, stooped and careful, seemed to carry a small spark of relief. The storm had passed, but the consequences remained. Some systems faltered. Some structures shifted. Some people felt the weight of risk, the cost of courage. And yet, something else had shifted as well. The human spirit. The awareness that silence is not always safety. And persistence is not always futile. He paused on a bridge, watching the river flow beneath fractured reflections of the city's lights. The water was relentless, moving forward regardless of obstacles. Carving paths through stone, through concrete, through time. And he realized, human effort is much the same. Small, persistent, quiet acts shape the course of life. Invisible, perhaps, to those not paying attention. But profound in their cumulative effect. The system, once opaque and untouchable, now bore signs of fracture. Not catastrophic, not dramatic, but undeniable. Policies shifted subtly. Influence recalculated. The invisible machinery creaked under the weight of observation and consequence. And those who had once believed themselves untouchable now realized that human awareness, once awakened, is unstoppable. He remembered the countless small acts that had persisted through it all. Neighbors sharing what little they had. Workers supporting each other quietly. Teachers staying late for students no one else noticed. These were the sparks that ignited the storm. The human threads that, woven together, became a force the system could not ignore. And he understood something essential. Courage is rarely spectacular. It is quiet. It is repetitive. It is deliberate. It is the refusal to accept the world as it is. Even when the world insists that acceptance is safer. He lit a cigarette, smoke drifting lazily into the dawn. And thought of the choices made, the risks accepted, the people who had acted without certainty. Yet with moral clarity. This was the true measure of impact. Not headlines, not fame, not immediate change. But the slow, quiet transformation of lives, attitudes, and expectations. The city exhaled around him. Windows reflected morning light, streets hummed with cautious energy. And life went on. But something fundamental had shifted. The ordinary people had found their voice. The invisible had become visible. And the weight of choice, once deferred, had been exercised. He smiled faintly, a calm intensity in his eyes. Because even when the storm has passed, even when silence returns, the impact remains. And history remembers not only the loud victories, but the quiet persistence of those who refuse to yield. And he whispered to himself, almost a benediction. Freedom isn't guaranteed. It's passed down, one brave choice at a time. And sometimes, the smallest act echoes the longest. The city moved forward, cautious, weary, aware. But alive. And perhaps that was the point. Even in the darkest tension, even amid the harshest storm, humanity persists. And maybe that's how it all begins again. The city woke slowly, bathed in a soft golden light. The storm's echoes had faded, replaced by a quieter rhythm. The streets no longer throbbed with tension. Instead, they pulsed gently with the small miracles of human life. Footsteps measured, conversations careful but warm, children chasing shadows on cracked sidewalks. He walked through the city, observing the aftereffects of everything that had transpired. It was remarkable, in its subtlety. The world hadn't transformed overnight. No headlines shouted triumph. No billboards announced victory. And yet, everywhere, change whispered. The mother at the corner bakery smiled at the cashier. She counted her coins more easily now. Her child clutched a loaf of bread without fear of tomorrow. The young man who had shouted in the plaza. He stood in a park, helping a neighbor carry groceries, a quiet grin on his face. Small acts, ordinary acts, yet charged with newfound meaning. The river reflected the city's lights like fractured glass. Shimmering and uncertain. But moving relentlessly forward. A reminder that life doesn't pause, even after storms. He paused on a bridge, cigarette forgotten in his hand. The world was still imperfect. The system was far from flawless. But the cracks he had observed, the fractures he had nudged into light, were enough to show possibility. Enough to remind him that human persistence cannot be fully contained. In cafes, in apartment buildings, in classrooms, people began to notice small shifts. A policy quietly amended. A procedure corrected. A voice given consideration it had been denied for decades. These were tiny victories, almost imperceptible. Yet profound in impact. Rippling through lives that had long been overlooked. He thought of all the choices, the risks, the courage that had brought the city here. Every whispered call, every quiet act of defiance, every person who had refused to yield, had contributed to this fragile renewal. And he realized something essential. Change is rarely loud. It is often quiet, incremental, almost invisible. But it is no less powerful for its subtlety. The sun rose higher, warming the streets, softening shadows. People paused to look up, to breathe, to notice. It was a small gesture, almost unconscious. Yet it carried weight. It was a reminder that even in the darkest tension, hope endures. He walked past the plaza where the storm had been fiercest. Signs were gone. Voices no longer chanted in unison. Yet the air carried something different now. A sense of possibility, of resilience, of human endurance. The city had been tested. And it had survived. Even the smallest interactions carried newfound significance. A neighbor holding a door, a teacher greeting a student, a friend offering a meal. Humanity persisted, quietly but resolutely. And that persistence, more than any headline, more than any revelation, was the true measure of progress. He exhaled slowly, feeling the calm settle over him. The storm had passed. The lessons remained. The human spirit endured. And he whispered to himself, softly, almost reverently. Freedom isn't guaranteed. It isn't delivered. It is nurtured, preserved, and fought for, one brave act at a time. The city moved forward, cautious, aware, alive. And in the gentle rhythm of life resuming, he felt something he hadn't felt in months. Light. Possibility. Renewal. And maybe, just maybe, that's how it all begins again. The city rested under a quiet sky. Not peaceful, not serene, the kind of quiet that comes after upheaval. When echoes of decisions made and consequences faced linger in every corner. The streets were familiar, yet charged with meaning. Like a landscape rewritten in invisible ink, readable only by those who had witnessed the storm. He walked slowly, noticing the subtleties. The shopkeeper stacking cans with deliberate care. Children laughing across empty lots. Neighbors speaking to one another with a warmth that had been buried beneath months of tension. Every gesture, every glance, carried the imprint of human endurance. And in that quiet, he understood the depth of what had transpired. The system, though resilient, had been exposed. Its machinery, once invisible, now bore signs of fracture. Not dramatic collapse. Not chaos. But a subtle, undeniable shift. The invisible had become partially visible. He remembered the documents, the calls, the choices, the risks. The people whose courage had been quiet but unyielding. The ordinary citizens who had persisted despite exhaustion, fear, and doubt. It became clear, the story wasn't about scandal. It wasn't about power for power's sake. It was about the intersection of human will and human consequence. Truth, he realized, is rarely comfortable. It is often inconvenient. It exposes, it challenges, it demands. And yet, it also illuminates. It gives perspective. It allows action. He passed a river that reflected the city's fractured lights like shards of memory. Each ripple carried the weight of choice. Each reflection a reminder that even small acts of courage leave a lasting trace. The ordinary had made the extraordinary possible. And the extraordinary had reminded the ordinary of its power. The storm, he knew, wasn't over. It never truly ends. Systems rebuild. Structures adapt. Power shifts, sometimes subtly, sometimes violently. But the human spirit, persistent, reflective, moral. That is the force that continues to shape reality. He stopped, looking out over the cityscape. The streets, the lights, the people moving through them. They were a living testament to resilience. Every decision, every risk, every act of courage had created a ripple. And in those ripples lay the hope of accountability, of fairness, of change. It struck him then, the moral of the storm is not victory. It is awareness. It is responsibility. It is the recognition that inaction is a choice. And that every choice carries weight. Not just for oneself. But for countless unseen lives that depend on the courage to act. The wind carried the scent of wet concrete and possibility. He inhaled slowly, feeling the weight lift, just enough. Leaving clarity in its place. The system may endure. The storm may recur. But humanity endures too, quietly, insistently, stubbornly. And as the sun crested the horizon, spilling light across the city, he whispered to himself, almost a prayer. Truth matters. Persistence matters. Choice matters. And sometimes, one person deciding to act can bend the course of countless lives. The city exhaled. The streets settled into rhythm again. But beneath that rhythm, subtle yet undeniable, was the knowledge that nothing is truly immutable. That courage, once exercised, becomes part of the city's heartbeat. And in that heartbeat, hope persists. And maybe, just maybe, that's how the story continues. Not with spectacle, not with chaos, but quietly, persistently. One human choice at a time. The city glimmered under the early morning sun. Windows caught the light and fractured it into shards that danced across sidewalks and streets. It was quiet, but not empty. Life moved forward with deliberate slowness, like the careful turning of pages in a book that refuses to be closed too quickly. He walked among the people, unnoticed yet aware. The mother carrying her child paused to greet a neighbor. The teenager running errands laughed, a sound light enough to cut through months of tension. Even the elderly man, stooped and careful, looked up and smiled faintly, as if the weight of recent events had lifted just enough to make space for hope. The storm had passed, leaving traces behind. Some were visible, signs of structural change, small policy shifts, conversations that had been impossible before. Some were invisible: courage, persistence, moral awakening, a sense of responsibility quietly embedding itself in the minds of ordinary citizens. And he realized, this is what endurance looks like. Not spectacle. Not applause. Not recognition. But quiet, patient impact, unfolding like light through morning fog. The river reflected the sky, its waters moving steadily, relentless. Carrying with them the stories of countless lives. Some scarred, some healed, some still waiting to be written. And he understood something essential. Life, like the river, moves forward regardless of human calculation. But the small interventions, the acts of bravery, the choices to persist. They redirect the current, subtly, inevitably, profoundly. He paused atop a hill, looking down on the city's grid, its streets alive with motion. And for the first time in months, he felt a sense of calm. The storm had tested everything: people, systems, morality. It had pushed limits, revealed cracks, forced decisions. And yet, here they were. Alive. Resilient. Enduring. The human spirit, he realized, cannot be fully broken. It bends. It falters. It suffers. But it persists. And persistence, when combined with courage and choice, becomes transformative. He lit a cigarette, smoke curling lazily into the morning air. And thought of all the lives touched, all the risks taken, all the silent battles fought. No single act was monumental, yet together, they were unstoppable. The ordinary had become extraordinary. And the extraordinary had reminded the ordinary of its own power, its own agency, its own responsibility. He reflected on the truth he had uncovered, the system he had exposed. The people he had witnessed enduring, fighting, and persisting. It wasn't about victory in the conventional sense. It wasn't about triumph over an enemy. It was about awareness, accountability, and the moral courage to act. Even when the outcome was uncertain, even when the stakes were immense. The city's lights flickered as the sun climbed higher, illuminating streets, buildings, and faces. It was a quiet celebration, subtle but profound. The storm had passed, but the lessons remained. Truth matters. Action matters. Courage matters. And even the smallest choice can echo across lives, reshaping reality in ways impossible to measure. He exhaled smoke one last time, letting it drift into the golden air. And whispered, almost reverently, as if to the city itself. If this story made you think, share it. Because truth survives only when it's told. And humanity thrives only when courage endures. The city moved forward, cautious, aware, alive. And in that movement, he saw light. Not blinding, not theatrical, but enduring. A subtle illumination that grows, spreads, and persists through darkness. And finally, in that quiet reflection, he whispered one last truth. And maybe. That's how it all begins again. The city had settled, but the echoes of the storm still lingered in the air. They weren't loud. Not in sirens or protests. Not in headlines or frantic calls. They were quiet echoes, the kind that curl into your chest when no one else is looking. The kind that remind you everything has changed, even if it doesn't feel immediate. He walked streets now familiar yet transformed. Storefronts opened on time. Subway cars rattled along tracks that had carried millions for decades. Children laughed, unconcerned with the machinery of power above their heads. But in subtle ways, life had shifted. Eyes were keener. Voices were firmer. People listened differently, moved differently, noticed more. The storm hadn't left victory behind. It had left understanding. And understanding, though quiet, is far more dangerous than chaos. It doesn't shout. It doesn't explode. It lingers, it spreads, it changes perception. He paused on a corner where a small crowd gathered. A teacher helped a student navigate a city map. A neighbor carried groceries for an elderly couple. A young man distributed water bottles to construction workers under the morning sun. Ordinary acts. Invisible acts. Yet profound in their cumulative force. The truth of the past weeks was clear. Systems can bend. Machines of influence can falter. Power can shift. But only if people act. Only if the ordinary refuses to be silent. He thought of the choices that had been made. The whispered calls, the leaks exposed, the risks accepted. None of it had been simple. None of it had been safe. But each small act had been a thread woven into a larger tapestry of change. And that tapestry was still forming. The river shimmered beneath him, its surface reflecting fractured city lights. It reminded him that life flows endlessly. But the smallest stones thrown in its path create ripples that reach far beyond their origin. The people who had acted, who had persisted quietly, had thrown stones that would echo for years. He watched the city breathe. It was cautious. It was tentative. It was resilient. And in that resilience lay hope. Not the flashy hope of headlines or speeches. But the enduring hope of human persistence, of moral courage, of small victories accumulating unseen. He lit a cigarette and inhaled slowly. The smoke drifted upward, dissolving into sunlight. And he thought, freedom isn't granted. It isn't given. It is claimed, defended, nurtured, and shared. One act at a time. People moved past him, unaware of the quiet epiphany lingering in the city streets. They carried groceries, walked dogs, laughed, argued, loved, and endured. And that, he realized, was the essence of continuity. Life doesn't wait for permission. Change doesn't require spectacle. Humanity persists. He reflected on the lessons etched into the past weeks. Courage matters. Truth matters. Persistence matters. Even the smallest choices leave traces. Even the quietest voices ripple through the lives of many. And as the sun climbed higher, casting light across streets, buildings, and people, he whispered once more, softly, as if sharing a secret with the world itself. And maybe that's how it all begins again. The city exhaled a slow, deliberate breath. The hum of life had returned, steady and persistent. But beneath the routine, the memory of upheaval remained. Like the faint echo of thunder long after the storm has passed. It wasn't in the headlines. It wasn't in the billboards. It was in the rhythm of footsteps, the cadence of conversations, the subtle change in how people moved through the streets. He walked alone, the sun low on the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched like questions across the pavement. Windows reflected the light back at him, fractured and shimmering. Reminding him that reality is never simple, never linear, never uniform. It bends under observation. It shifts under courage. And it carries the imprint of countless choices, spoken and unspoken, made quietly in rooms unseen. People passed, faces familiar and unfamiliar. Some smiled, some hurried, some paused to help a stranger. Ordinary acts, nearly invisible. Yet in that invisibility lay the truest power of human action. Not grand gestures, not speeches, not headlines. But the persistence of decency, courage, and awareness, day after day. He thought of the risks, the decisions, the nights of quiet calculation and moral wrestling. Every choice had consequences, some immediate, some unfolding slowly like a river carving stone. And he understood now, the measure of impact is not always seen. It is felt, deeply, quietly, in the lives altered, in the hearts emboldened, in the systems nudged ever so slightly toward accountability. The city's river reflected the waning light, a mirror of fractured beauty. He leaned against the railing, watching the current move relentlessly forward. Life doesn't pause for reflection. Time doesn't wait for insight. But the choices made within it, deliberate, courageous, human. Leave a trail, subtle yet enduring, like footprints on a shore that stretches beyond memory. He remembered the people he had witnessed endure. The mother counting pennies, the teenager navigating double shifts, the elderly man calculating every step. He remembered the small victories, the acts of defiance, the courage unspoken but persistent. They were the real story. Not scandal. Not headlines. Not spectacle. But the ordinary asserting itself against the currents of indifference, against the inertia of the unseen machinery of power. And he realized that the storm, though past, was not the end. It was a beginning. A reminder that vigilance, courage, and moral clarity are ongoing. The system may endure, may rebuild, may obscure itself again. But the human spirit persists. Persistent, patient, deliberate. And in that persistence lies hope. He exhaled, smoke drifting upward into the amber light, dissolving slowly into the city's breath. The streets, the people, the small acts of endurance. All carried the quiet truth. Change is cumulative. Courage is contagious. Truth, once illuminated, continues to ripple through lives, invisible yet undeniable. He whispered to himself, softly, almost a prayer. Freedom isn't a gift. It is earned. It is nurtured. It is defended in ways both spectacular and silent. And it survives only because people persist, because they choose, because they act. The city moved forward. Slowly. Carefully. Resiliently. The past, with its storms and revelations, left traces, yes. But the future remained unwritten, a canvas awaiting the choices of those willing to stand. And in that quiet awareness, he understood the ultimate truth. Life bends toward those who act with conscience. History remembers those who persist. And humanity, in its imperfection, in its endurance, is the force that shapes the world quietly, relentlessly, beautifully. He turned, walking into the lengthening shadows, carrying nothing but awareness, courage, and hope. And he whispered one final time. And maybe. That's how it all begins again. The city had learned to breathe again, slowly, deliberately, as if recovering from months of strain. The streets moved, not with the hurried panic of the storm, but with a measured rhythm, each footstep echoing persistence rather than fear. People crossed intersections with cautious certainty. Children played under fading neon shadows. And somewhere, a dog barked, a sound of ordinary life insisting itself into the world. He walked through familiar avenues, observing the details that often go unnoticed. A janitor sweeping outside a high-rise. A teacher speaking softly to a student who had stumbled. Neighbors carrying groceries for each other, quietly, without acknowledgement. These acts, simple, invisible, often ignored, were the true measure of recovery, the unseen scaffolding of society. The storm had passed, but its lessons remained imprinted in every face, every gesture, every conversation. People had learned, in ways too subtle for headlines, that courage is cumulative. That persistence, even in silence, reshapes reality. That moral clarity is a quiet force, capable of bending the arc of systems if exercised consistently. He paused at a plaza where sunlight cut through the trees, casting long, fractured shadows across cracked pavement. A young man distributed food to the elderly. A group of friends carried a fallen bicycle back to its owner. And a street musician played a tune that seemed to echo the rhythm of the city itself. Steady, enduring, unbroken. The storm had revealed the fragility of the structures above. The machinery of power that often seemed immutable. But it had also revealed the resilience of the people beneath. Ordinary citizens, mothers, fathers, students, workers. Who persisted, who acted, who chose courage over convenience. Were the true architects of lasting change. He lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly, watching smoke curl upward into the morning light. Even now, weeks after the upheaval, the ripples of action continued. Small victories that were invisible to the news cycle. Small acts of courage that refused recognition. Had set in motion changes that would be felt for years, quietly, persistently. The river nearby reflected fractured sunlight. Its waters moving relentlessly, indifferent to human concern. Yet shaped subtly by every stone, every leaf, every intervention along its banks. And he realized, human persistence is like that. Quiet, patient, often unnoticed. But capable of carving paths through the hardest obstacles. And reshaping the flow of life itself. He looked around, taking in the ordinary scenes of the city. A mother helping her child tie shoelaces. A shopkeeper greeting a regular customer by name. A student handing a lost notebook back to its owner. Each act small, mundane, yet charged with the weight of continuity, responsibility, and moral courage. The storm had ended, but the work of humanity never does. Systems rebuild, structures adapt, power shifts. But the choices of ordinary people persist, ripple outward, and shape reality in ways immeasurable and enduring. And that persistence, quiet as it is unstoppable. He whispered softly to himself, letting the words merge with the gentle hum of the city. Life bends toward those who act. Courage echoes beyond its origin. The ordinary, when persistent, becomes extraordinary. And the world, however imperfect, continues, because people refuse to let it stop. The city moved forward, cautious, aware, alive. And in that quiet rhythm, he saw the truth of everything. Change does not require spectacle. It does not demand recognition. It simply requires persistence. And persistence, exercised with conscience, endures. He turned away, stepping into the lengthening light of evening. Carrying with him nothing but awareness, responsibility, and hope. And as he walked, he whispered one last thought, almost a prayer to the city itself. And maybe. That's how it all begins again. The city's pulse was steady now, but not uniform. It had been reshaped, not by destruction, not by spectacle, but by countless small decisions, small acts, small choices, made quietly yet decisively. Windows caught the morning light, fracturing it into thin beams that stretched across streets and sidewalks. And in those fractured beams, he saw the reflections of every moment that had come before, every protest, every whispered call, every courageous act that had forced change into motion. He walked through avenues now familiar yet forever altered. Children ran past, their laughter carrying over the sidewalks. Workers carried tools and groceries alike, speaking with a warmth that had been absent before the storm. The city had endured. And in that endurance, it had transformed, not visibly, not immediately, but fundamentally. He stopped on a quiet street corner, watching neighbors greet one another with gestures once too small to notice. A teacher lingered with a student, guiding, correcting, encouraging. A delivery driver handed a package to an elderly woman, taking a moment to smile. Ordinary acts. Mundane. Yet they carried an extraordinary weight. The weight of continuity. The weight of choice. The weight of moral persistence. The storm had revealed fractures in the system, cracks, loopholes, inequities. And it had revealed the resilience of people who refused to be silenced, ignored, or sidelined. It had reminded everyone that change is rarely sudden. It is incremental. Cumulative. Invisible to many, yet undeniable in its effects. He thought of the human lives that had intersected with the upheaval. The mother counting pennies to feed her child. The young man risking ridicule to speak truth. The elderly man observing, waiting, finally acting. Each one had played a role. Each one had contributed to the subtle but lasting transformation of the city's rhythm. The river reflected the golden light of dawn. Its currents moving steadily, carrying leaves, branches, and the echoes of every stone thrown in its path. And he understood, human choice is the same. Quiet, patient, persistent, capable of redirecting the flow of countless lives. shaping reality in ways unseen yet irrevocable. He lit a cigarette, smoke rising lazily into the sky. And thought about truth. Not the kind printed on headlines. Not the kind broadcast across televisions. But the truth that lives in human action. The truth that persists when people act with conscience, courage, and awareness. The city moved forward, cautious yet alive. People carried on with their lives, seemingly ordinary. Yet each step forward was imbued with the moral weight of all that had transpired. Every small decision now carried consequence, every voice mattered, every choice counted. The storm had ended, but its resonance endured. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But deeply, persistently, quietly, like a river reshaping stone over decades. And in that quiet, he whispered to himself, almost a prayer to the city itself. Persistence matters. Courage matters. Choice matters. Even the smallest act ripples farther than we can imagine. The streets, the people, the city, all moved forward together. Cautious, aware, alive, and resilient. And he felt, finally, a deep, serene understanding. The story is never truly over. It evolves. It persists. It spreads. And humanity, in all its imperfection and perseverance, is the force that carries it forward. He exhaled, smoke curling into the sunlit air. And whispered one last truth, softly, almost a secret. And maybe. That's how it all begins again. The city had settled into a rhythm both familiar and transformed. Its streets glimmered in the soft glow of dawn. And the hum of life, steady, persistent, unyielding, carried the weight of countless choices. It was quiet, but it was alive. Every step, every glance, every small act carried meaning. He walked slowly through the avenues, watching the ordinary become extraordinary. A mother guided her child across a busy street. A teacher paused to help a student who had stumbled. A neighbor lent a hand to someone carrying groceries, and a street musician played a tune that lingered in the ears long after it ended. These were not headlines. They were not victories broadcast to the world. They were acts of humanity, small yet indelible. And together, they had reshaped the pulse of the city. The storm had passed, leaving scars and traces. But it had also left clarity. Systems had bent under pressure. Injustices had been illuminated. But the most profound transformation had occurred in the people themselves. Courage had been exercised. Persistence had been tested. And ordinary individuals had discovered extraordinary resilience. He paused by the river, watching its current move relentlessly forward. The water reflected sunlight in fractured patterns, reminding him that life, like truth, does not wait. It moves, it adapts, it persists. And every small intervention, a word, a choice, a step, leaves ripples that extend far beyond immediate perception. He reflected on the people he had witnessed endure. The young man who risked ridicule to speak truth. The mother who persisted despite exhaustion. The teacher, the neighbor, the unseen helpers who refused to remain passive. Every one of them had contributed to a subtle, powerful force. A force capable of bending the currents of reality, shaping the world in quiet, profound ways. The city itself seemed to recognize this shift. Buildings, streets, lights, even the air, everything carried a sense of attentiveness. Not obedience. Not control. But awareness. The knowledge that human action matters. That truth cannot be fully suppressed. That moral courage persists long after headlines fade. He exhaled slowly, cigarette smoke curling into the early light. And realized the ultimate truth of everything he had witnessed. The storm was not the story. The aftermath was not the story. The story was the persistence of humanity. Its courage, its moral clarity, its quiet insistence on dignity and action. That is what endures. That is what ripples. That is what shapes the world. The wind carried voices, faint yet resolute. Laughter. Conversation. Footsteps. A child's cry. Ordinary sounds of life, imbued now with significance. Every note, every echo, every subtle movement was a testament to the choices made when circumstances demanded courage. And in that quiet symphony, the city found its heartbeat. He turned from the river, walking through the streets one last time. Each person he passed carried the invisible weight of persistence. Every small act of integrity, of bravery, of human decency, had created this subtle, lasting transformation. And he understood, clearly, profoundly, that change does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it moves silently, persistently, until its effect is undeniable. And as he walked into the fading shadows of morning, he whispered one final truth, soft enough that only the world itself might hear. Freedom isn't given. Courage isn't celebrated. Truth isn't easy. But persistence, quiet, deliberate, moral persistence, that is unstoppable. And that is how the world changes. The city moved forward, cautious yet resilient. Life carried on. And yet, beneath every gesture, every step, every breath, the echo of human choice persisted. Unseen, perhaps, but eternal. And in that eternal echo, he whispered one last time, almost a prayer. And maybe that's how it all begins again.